So I want to end this lecture by looking at this concept called postmodernism. So if you've taken a philosophy class, you are probably familiar with this idea. I'm not going to get too deep into it because I just want to give you the nuts and bolts of it and kind of just explain it, how it relates to women's history. So the postmodernist, it's an intellectual group, it's a philosophical movement that really begins to take off around the 1950s and 60s. It's mostly French, though not completely, and it actually really made its impact here in the United States, and then it went back to France, where it became really popular. So the postmodernists are kind of reacting to the modern era. So they're again alive in the 50s and 60s, and the belief was that around the year 1900 was that progress and technology was going to make life better for everybody, right? Based on these notions of efficiency and industrialism. So, there's a lot of good that came out of the turn of the century in the 1900s with, medicine, right? People are not dying as often. A lot of technology that emerges, industrialism, better, new chemistry, better job opportunities, such as the what do you call it, the assembly line and things like that, that people were able to make a living. So the idea was that, again, science was going to make things better for people. The reality was that a lot of people did not improve their life. Obviously, there's a lot of racism, there's a lot of problems during this period. Certain groups just did not benefit. And you have this intellectual movement called postmodernism that critiques the modern age between the modern age is between 1900 to about 1950s, and the postmodernists kind of argue, every era of history has come up with a philosophical argument saying why they're better than the previous age, and what we find is that none of it has really helped, right? You still have a lot of poor people, obviously a lot of sexism, a lot of racism. They're coming out of World War II with the Holocaust. So society has not really improved that much. So postmodernists are kind of challenging the idea that maybe a philosophical idea is out there that's going to help everybody. So postmodernists are not really kind of replacing modernism, but they are challenging it. They begin to argue that truth is relative, right? You're probably familiar with this idea. So if you're like extremely religious, or if you believe in science or in math or something like that, right? That these things are absolute, right? You do a study or something like that, you're going to get an absolute answer. Or again, if you're religious, your religious text is some kind of absolute truth and you cannot question it, even though it might contradict itself here and there. To you, it's an absolute truth, right? Well, postmodernists say, well, the problem with all these ideas is that all these ideas, all these claims to truth are relative. And the reason why that is because everything is a human construction. And language, in particular, because that's how we communicate with each other, right, is a human construction. We've always known that, right? We can go back to Shakespeare when he talks about a rose, that which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. In other words, we can call a rose by whatever we want, right? We can call it a table. It doesn't change its shape. It doesn't change its smell. It still looks like a rose, or what we have defined as a rose. But what it's telling us is that the word itself is meaningless. The only reason it has meaning is because we as a society agreed upon its meaning. In other words, its definition is not absolute, right? So what their postmodernists are arguing is that all knowledge is learned rather than pre-existing. Now this is significant, particularly to a class like ours, because a lot of times we assume women's roles to be quote unquote traditional, or whatever it may be. And if you ever study history, these notions of quote unquote traditional gender roles are really kind of 19th century concepts. Prior to that, that doesn't mean things were any better prior to this period, but a lot of times women had to work because everybody had to help around the house and make sure you were fed for the next day, right? So these notions that we have of absolute ideas of gender or of race or whatever they may be are things that are learned, right? They are not pre-programmed in us. Now, if you want to believe those things, that's really your personal opinion, but it's not a truth. And kind of to go back to this idea of language being a human construction, we've always known this. Again, I talked about Shakespeare, but we also see it with a simple term like, if you're to think of an apple right now, I can guarantee you each have a different definition of this concept. Most of you will probably have this, right, which is your traditional apple, and it's red. And some of you, it might remind you even the Snow White, right, already kind of challenging the idea of absolute definition right there. Some of you might think of a green apple because maybe favorite color, or maybe you just like the flavor more, right? A green apple and a red apple do have a different flavor. Some of you might think of something very different from that, right? Something that's related more to technology, like an Apple computer or an iPhone or whatever, tablet, or just the idea of technology, right? Because Apple has revolutionized our current culture in the last 40 to 50 years. Others might think of maybe a person, maybe a friend named Apple. I think this little girl right here is named Apple. I think she's much older today, but again, we moved away from this idea of some product that you consume to all of a sudden being a person. Or you probably might even think of the Adam and Eve story, right? Where the Bible doesn't mention apple, yet our mind might gravitate to the Adam and Eve, where the snake gives Eve an apple or something like that. So again, all these concepts are human constructions. You would think if there was an absolute truth, then we would all have the same conclusion. In reality, we all have different answers to the same word. So what postmodernists are kind of saying is that beyond just all words being all words and just people being concepts being human construction or socially constructed, they begin to challenge the idea of how these concepts come into being, right? So how do we obtain meaning? It's really kind of breaking down basic concepts that we take for granted. Over here you see this idea of apples and oranges. So what postmodernists argue is that in order for us to understand one thing, we need its opposite in order to give meaning to the object we are trying to define. So if we want to understand what an apple is, we need something that's completely different in order to understand it, right? And this is what they call binary opposition. It's called the object-subject dichotomy. So in order for me to understand the thing I'm trying to define, i.e. the object, I need something that is different from it, i.e. its subject, right? And ultimately, these things have no universal meaning, but what postmodernists are trying to hint at is that in order to understand the object that you are trying to define, power is an element that is utilized. So just to give you a few examples, a concept like human beings and particularly race, ultimately we are all human beings, right? It doesn't matter what color you may be. We're all just people, right? Just might be different shades. However, throughout Western history, we have defined certain people as superior while other people as inferior. So when it comes to the object, which is the superior, it tended to be defined as European. Whereas the subject, right? How do I know I'm smart? Well, I need something the opposite of that that's not smart. And at this, quote unquote, right? During this period, we see concepts of civilization, which is associated with Europeans, And we see people that are quote unquote uncivilized with non-European people, whether they be Native Americans or people from different parts of the world that might not have some of the same things that Europeans have. It could be the arts, it could be the sciences, whatever it may be. So Europeans begin to define themselves as superior, and they define everybody else as inferior. So it shows you that a binary opposition are not just two things that you're trying to compare, like apples and oranges, but rather we see how power creates this notion of something that is normal, right, the object, against those things that are the opposite, that is abnormal, being the subject. So we see this not only in this kind of postmodern argument and this kind of abstract concept, but we also see it in everyday meaning. So just to give you an example, another example, I guess, we see it with men and women, right? We believe in these concepts, some people, I'm not saying everybody, that men are superior to women, right? Men would fall under the idea of the object, and women will fall under the idea of the subject. So we're not just comparing, biological differences, but we also, throughout history, we have defined women as this and that, inferior, that they must take care of the man, that they must take care of the family, that they are more concerned with the welfare of other people, that they're very emotional, right? All the stereotypes that are associated with women to diminish them, right? To make them the subject, and men put themselves as the object, as superior. So this is the way we have created this idea of, quote unquote, normal and abnormal. And that's what postmodernism does. It's not saying this system is correct, all right? I want that to be a walkaway point, right? Where I don't want you to think postmodernists are saying, objects, subjects are normal or whatever, that we should do these things. Rather, they're trying to show you how they are all socially constructed, which means if they are socially constructed, they could be undermined, where we could put women over here as the object and men as the subject, right? To challenge this binary system. And just to give you an example, right? Women can give birth, and women can handle a lot of pain, right? Women care about other people, right? Again, some of these might be stereotypes. And then all of a sudden we put women over here as the object, and men are weak, right? Men need women in order to define themselves, and blah, 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 right? We could put men over here as the subject. So what postmodernists are saying is that we can undermine the very system that we have created throughout history, and kind of switch sides if we wanted to. And actually, we will do that when we talk about feminism in the 1960s, particularly with Valerie Solanas. All right, so I kind of want to end it there. And, again, we covered a lot of terms. We'll use a lot of these terms throughout the semester. Agency, hegemony, postmodernism. I might not use the word, but it will be within each lecture or something like that, within the readings, showing how systems of binary exist. And hopefully it gives you an idea of topics that we will be covering as we move forward. All right, so we'll end it there, and make sure to complete the questions. Have a good day.